Empiezo a contaros la parte de cita de la tarde. Buenas tardes a todos, espero que os haya dado tiempo a tomar algo y a hablar un poco de VIAF para que se os fuera quedando. He recibido un montón y he visto cómo han recibido, sobre todo los que han presentado la cita de esta mañana, un montón de felicitaciones, incluso alguna persona que ha dicho: yo me he ido corriendo a ver cómo funcionaba eso al salir de aquí, lo cual quiere decir que la cita de esta mañana pues ha gustado, y eso siempre está bien. Vamos a hacerlo ahora un poquitín diferente. Os voy a presentar primero a Bárbara. No la voy a presentar, que ya le he presentado esta mañana. A lo mejor hay una o dos personas nuevas, pero la mayoría sois los mismos, o sea que ya la conocéis. Voy a presentar a Inma, Ferran y Elena Escolano. Y el orden de intervención va a ser primero Bárbara, después Elena y después Inma. Pero como Inma nos viene también de fuera y en ese sentido es nuestra invitada ahora mismo, pues va a ir la presentación en primer lugar. Luego se van a sentar ellas dos allí, nos quedaremos Bárbara y yo aquí hablando porque prefieren, por ver las diapositivas y eso, consideran que es más cómodo el estar puestas ahí. Bueno, Inma Ferran es licenciada por Geografía e Historia y está diplomada en Biblioteconomía y Documentación por la Universidad de Catalunya. Es la jefa del Servicio de Normalización Bibliográfica de la Biblioteca de Catalunya desde 2001. Es, por tanto, la responsable de toda la normativa que se hace en la biblioteca y también de los catálogos de autoridad por lo mismo, y sobre todo en estos momentos del reciente catálogo cooperativo que hace relativamente poco tiempo han inaugurado, Càntic, que es el catálogo de autoritats de norms y títols de Catalunya. Dentro de los grupos de trabajo trabaja también, al igual que os he comentado Ricardo esta mañana o al igual que comentaré ahora de Elena, dentro del Consejo de Cooperación Bibliotecaria en el grupo de normalización. Este grupo se encarga básicamente del control de puntos, pero no únicamente, del control de puntos de acceso de toda la parte de normalización internacional de la catalogación. O sea, siguen la normativa, intentan adaptarla, intentan traspasárnosla a nosotros y luego traspasarla a todas las bibliotecas regionales para que a su vez dicha normativa se vaya difuminando en el buen sentido, se vaya expandiendo. Luego tiene un trabajo importante de normalización dentro de todo el entorno catalán. Y vendría ahora Elena Escolano. Bueno, Elena Escolano yo creo que aquí necesita poca presentación, pero como hay que hacerlo, vamos a ello. Es una persona muy conocida, licenciada en el ámbito de la normalización, licenciada por la Universidad Complutense, con un curso de posgrado en documentación especializada en la misma universidad. Trabaja en la Biblioteca Nacional desde el año 85, o sea que lleva aquí una larga temporada. Durante varios años fue la jefe del servicio de catalogación de esta entidad, de la Biblioteca Nacional de España. Perdón, os iba a pasar a Elena ahora. Y desde 2007 es la jefe del Servicio de Coordinación y Normalización. Es el momento en que se crea dicho servicio. Bueno, Elena trabaja muchísimo en todo el tema de coordinación, no solamente a nivel de Biblioteca Nacional, sino a nivel del ámbito, no solamente a nivel de biblioteca, sino del ámbito nacional. Es la coordinadora de dicho grupo de normalización del que he estado hablando antes continuamente. Y también trabaja muy activamente en el ámbito internacional, sobre todo en todo lo relativo a IFLA. Dentro de IFLA es miembro del Comité Permanente de la sección de catalogación. Es la presidenta del grupo de revisión de las ISDBD y la que ha llevado, por tanto, toda la revisión, la parte más activa en toda la revisión de las ISBD hasta llegar a conseguir la ISBD normalizada. Es miembro ex oficio del grupo de revisión de FRBR y ha sido también miembro del comité de catalogación, el que creó el Código Internacional de Catalogación, del cual hablé antes cuando estuve comentando el currículum que tenía Bárbara. Bueno, pues esto, digamos que por un lado, en cuanto a las presentaciones. Voy a comentaros mínimamente por qué hemos hecho también esta parte de cita ¿Qué es RDA? No lo voy a contar yo, pero bueno, voy a contaros un mínimo de historia y luego ya paso a los ponentes. Yo volví a la biblioteca, y perdonar que empiece en primera persona, en el 2007. Una de las primeras cosas que me dijeron fue que consideraban que teníamos que hacer unas nuevas reglas de catalogación porque estaban muy desactualizadas y bueno, era Vox Populi que las reglas necesitaban cambios. Entonces, las reglas de catalogación han cumplido ahora, no lo habían cumplido entonces, pero bueno, lo han cumplido ya 25 años, con lo cual, obviamente, entre medias han pasado muchas cosas y es verdad que las reglas se habían quedado obsoletas y habían durado mucho porque, gracias a Dios, habían sido unas reglas pues yo creo que muy buenas y muy bien preparadas y muy bien presentadas. En principio pensé que sí, entonces, bueno, la primera idea, empezamos a hablar, a tener un poco de reuniones, ver qué es lo que podíamos hacer. Se trataba de buscar un grupo de trabajo que fuera coherente, en el cual, dentro del marco establecido por toda la normativa de bibliotecaria en el más amplio nivel, estuvieran recogidos diferentes grupos de bibliotecas y estuviera todo bibliotecas especializadas y bibliotecas por niveles de tipo de biblioteca. Bueno, todo más o menos estaba así, pero un viaje a Florencia con el inicio de las REICAT, de las reglas de catalogación italianas, nos empezó a hacer ver que quizás sería mejor plantarnos un poco, seguir esperando un poco y empezar a ver un poco qué es lo que estaba haciéndose a nivel europeo, que se estaba haciendo mucho, a nivel internacional, que se estaba haciendo bastante más. Se estaban en ese momento reorganizando las ISBD, estaban cambiando, estaban a punto de salir los principios internacionales de catalogación, como así ha sido. La RDA todavía no estaba, pero estaba en camino, está en camino. Con lo cual quizá era mejor, bueno, pues estabilizar un poco y ver qué posibilidades teníamos y no queríamos desmarcarnos del entorno internacional, no nos parecía que en este momento fuera lo mejor. Y dentro del entorno internacional ver qué nos interesaba más, dónde podíamos estar mejor. En febrero de 2009 se creó un grupo de trabajo interno de la BN que fue llevado por Elena Escolano, para ver un poco el borrador de la SRBA que nos habían mandado desde la Library of Congress y puntualizar lo que a nosotros nos parecía, lo que a la Biblioteca Nacional le parecía. Se enviaron las cosas que considerábamos que no estaban o que no se acercaban del todo a lo que para nosotros podía ser, que nos impedían de alguna forma a lo mejor acercarnos más a ellas. Esto fue enviado por diferentes países. Y bueno, con todo esto en marcha, a finales de 2009 decidimos que a inicios de 2010 empezaríamos a utilizar en este impasse de espera las ISBD consolidadas para toda la parte de descripción y el resto, para forma y elección de puntos de acceso, etcétera, etcétera, se continuarían utilizando las reglas. Entonces, en principio, esto también se le planteó al grupo de normalización, estuvieron también completamente de acuerdo y, bueno, por el momento estamos en eso. No se ha tomado ninguna decisión, seguimos trabajando con ISBD y con reglas de catalogación. El grupo de normalización sigue trabajando en ayudar un poco a ver cómo podemos ir y qué es lo que se está haciendo. Se van haciendo trabajos preparatorios que os irá comentando Elena. Y entonces, con eso, bueno, digamos que todo esto nos lleva a decir ahora mismo qué es lo que tenemos. Tenemos unas ISBD, tenemos unos principios internacionales de catalogación y están a punto de tener, y otros países probablemente lo van a coger, las RDA. De las RDA no os voy a comentar nada, puesto que largo y tendido os van a hablar de ellas, pero lo que sí que os quería comentar es que en junio de 2009 un grupo de personas que asistimos semestralmente a los meetings de la American Library Association, pues un grupo de personas relacionadas con el proceso técnico y procedente de bibliotecas nacionales europeas, en concreto de 4, de Alemania, Suecia, Gran Bretaña y España, nos juntamos y dijimos, pues algo tendríamos que hacer, puesto que venimos aquí, entre otras cosas, muy interesados en qué es lo que está pasando desde el punto de vista de las reglas de catalogación. Entonces, bueno, decidimos en aquel momento que podíamos formar un grupo que está recién nacido, de un grupo de interés de las RDA en Europa, un grupo europeo de interés de las RDA que se llama EURIC. European Interest Group, European RDA Interest Group, con la intención de hacer un seguimiento de los mismos y un desarrollo. La verdad es que yo iba a terminar un poco la presentación de todos ellos con esto, pero como a lo mejor se alarga, prefiero contároslo ya y bueno, luego ya siguen ellos. Entonces, con la creación de este grupo europeo, empezamos a preparar en Boston, en el meeting de invierno de la American Library Association, empezamos a preparar un pequeño seminario que pudiera dar a conocer al nivel europeo qué era lo que estaban haciendo. Entonces, el Joint Steering Committee, del cual forma parte también Bárbara, y otras muchas personas se mostraron muy interesados en el asunto, puesto que las RDA intentan tener una proyección internacional, pues esto evidentemente era una forma de tenderles una mano a ellos y que ellos nos la tendieran a nosotros. Entonces se empezó a preparar este seminario se llevará a cabo el día anterior de comienzo de la IFLA, 2 días antes es el día 8, la IFLA comienza oficialmente me parece que es el día 10 y entonces a él asistiremos las bibliotecas nacionales europeas. Bueno, cada cual expondrá un poco, las que van más adelantadas expondrán un poco qué es lo que han hecho hasta ahora en favor de seguir las RDA, que hay bibliotecas que lo tienen muy claro, otras expondremos mínimamente en dónde estamos, nuestras dudas y nuestros problemas. O sea que va a ser más que nada, bueno, pues una jornada un poco de reflexión prematura, puesto que no han nacido del todo, o no han nacido del todo desde el punto de vista práctico, pero sí una reflexión prematura de hacia dónde podemos encaminarnos los países europeos, si podemos coger el mismo tren o si cada uno vamos a tener que coger, bueno, trenes diferentes. Y en ello estamos. Entonces, bueno, si buscáis en la página web, como yo no he hecho diapositivas porque mi presentación no daba para eso, pues es fácil encontrar por Euric la página donde está la mínima información. Ya os digo que es un grupo reciente, no hay prácticamente nada. Lo que intentamos es cada uno en nuestro país por nuestra cuenta y todos juntos ver lo que hemos hecho los otros y qué problemas comunes tenemos, qué nos pueden aportar, qué ayudas les podemos pedir y bueno, de esa forma ver si realmente vamos todos juntos o nos quedamos un poco descolgados o decidimos otra forma o ese es el principio para algo nuevo, no lo sabemos. Bueno, muchísimas gracias de nuevo por la asistencia. Sé que las 4 de la tarde para aquí es una hora bastante mala, pero veo que os habéis mantenido bastantes, lo cual agradezco muchísimo y paso ya la palabra a Bárbara. Bárbara Tillet.
Buenas tardes. I think that's fine. No, it's good. Mara was asking if I could do an overview presentation about RDA, Resource Description and Access. So that's my intention here, to explain to you a little bit about the background, the foundations of RDA, and then tell you a little bit of where we're headed into the future. So I will begin actually with talking more about just the general foundations for RDA and mention that we're talking about providing bibliographic control over the entire bibliographic universe. Not a real universe, but it's a universe of not just books, but many kinds of galaxies and worlds of content that's been packaged in various carriers. For example, as serials, as manuscripts, musical scores, globes, all kinds of ways. RDA is a new cataloging tool that's built on a rich tradition of cataloging that includes internationally shared cataloging principles and standards, like the International Standards for Bibliographic Description, and the conceptual models of FRBR, which is Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, and FRAD, which is functional requirements for authority data. And all of these things are the foundation for RDA. RDA came from a recognizing of the need to describe digital materials in a new internet environment to reach our users. This is more and more the environment where we are dealing with our users. So it has involved a lot of collaboration with other metadata communities beyond libraries and has benefited from some worldwide comments, as Mar suggested, during the development stages. So I'll touch on some of these influences very briefly, and I will start with the Anglo-American Cataloging Code. It evolved over 2 centuries, starting with the famous 91 Rules of Antonio Panizzi from the British Museum in 1841. In the United States, at a few decades later, Charles Cutter put together his set of rules that was based on the library practices in the United States at that time. Cutter wrote about the objectives of a catalog to help users find things and to co-locate them, bring them together in a catalog. And I'll come back to that idea of co-location in a moment. The British and the Americans tried for many years to agree on cataloging rules, but with no success. A series of rules appeared, and then following the 1961 Paris conference that agreed on principles, they tried again. But even then they failed. So you'll see here there were 2 editions, a British edition of the text and a North American edition of the text, each with slight variations. There were even more changes and improvements in trying to internationalize and agree on an international level. And within IFLA in particular, there was agreement on the International Standard Bibliographic Description. Michael Gorman was one of the leaders of that effort. And he also then came back with other colleagues in the United States to work together to create Anglo-American Cataloging Rules 2nd edition. This was the first time that we actually had agreement, finally, between the United Kingdom and the United States. And we also added Canada and eventually added Australia to the group of responsible parties in the Anglo-American part of the world. However, when the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules 2nd edition came in 1978, it was a very traumatic time for libraries, particularly in the United States, that had been following AACR 1 in the North American text. This is because the whole idea about how you should enter the names of corporate bodies completely changed. This was called de-superimposition. Terrible word, but what it means is that they were getting rid of some old rules that had been superimposed on the cataloging rules, so they were finally going to follow the cataloging rules for a change. But it was a very expensive prospect for libraries to make that big of a change. It meant they had to close their card catalogs or create split card catalogs, because this was before we had online catalogs. But by making this big change, it meant that companies finally decided it's time, we need to develop online catalogs. So the change moved us from card catalog based to an online catalog base. Although the Anglo-American cataloging rules still very much were focused on displaying information like we saw it on a catalog card. After the first edition, there were several other editions coming. We still called it AACR 2, but there were really big changes as we kept going along to add more rules about handling serials, later for handling integrating resources, and so on as time went by. And over the past 30 years, we have adjusted both AACR 2 and our cataloging systems, and we moved from the cards to online. But now it's time again for a change. IFLA has been the center for international cataloging standards for the world and has been very influential in providing foundations and information. In the 1950s, going back again to IFLA's influence, there was a study done by Seymour Lubetsky. At the time, he was working at the Library of Congress, and he was commissioned to study the rules that were in use in the United States and in England. As part of his study, he developed some basic principles, and he took those principles to IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutes, for their famous Paris conference in 1961. It was a meeting of experts. The resulting Paris principles, as we know them today, became the foundation of nearly all of the major cataloging codes used throughout the world. And that was an incredible step to global harmonization of cataloging practices that's still our goal today. But now, 40 years after the Paris principles, IFLA again reviewed their principles. And there was a series of 5 regional meetings worldwide between 2002 and 2007, and IFLA reached another milestone in developing international cataloging principles. Elena Escolano and myself were part of the planning committee that helped do this regional series of meetings, and we finally published in 2009 the new International Cataloging Principles known as ICP. That includes also translation of these principles and a glossary to use to share vocabulary in 20 languages, and there are now more and more languages being added on the IFLA website. Now again, back in IFLA, in the 1960s, IFLA held a meeting of experts to develop the international standards for bibliographic descriptions that I mentioned before. And they provide the basic descriptive elements arranged in a prescribed order with prescribed punctuation. There's now a consolidated edition of ISBD, and the makers of RDA were keeping close watch on what was happening in IFLA for this effort to share information and to harmonize the work between ISBD and RDA. Again, the current chair of ISBD Review Group is Elena Escolano, and in previous discussions with the ISBD group, the Joint Steering Committee for the Development of RDA, and previously the Joint Steering Committee for the revision of the Anglo-American Cataloging rules, worked very closely with the ISBD review groups to harmonize our practices and make sure we're following the same. During the 1990s, IFLA again took a lead in bibliographic control to develop a conceptual model known as FRBR, Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records. It was published in 1998 and reinforces some basic objectives, even back to Cutter's time, remember, about the importance of co-locating things, providing relationships, and being able to find things in a catalog. It helps users fulfill basic user tasks with respect to the catalog, enabling people to find, identify, select, and obtain the information that they want. These are known as the FRBR users tasks and build on those older cataloging traditions of finding and co-locating materials. FRBR also offers us a structure to meet those basic user tasks, and it includes an entity relationship model. It's meant to be a theoretical model, a conceptual model of how everything in our bibliographic universe operates. All of the things that are identified in the universe and how they're interrelated to each other. It allows us to group together things that share same intellectual and artistic content, and it gives us a new way to look at this bibliographic universe. It's like putting on a new pair of glasses to see the universe in a new way. It also includes a set of data elements or attributes that are mandatory for a national level bibliographic record. All of that kind of idea is carried over into RDA as the basic data elements or the core elements for RDA for description and access. So RDA combines the FRBR conceptual model with the cataloging principles to give us the intellectual foundation so that we can build catalogers' judgment and a better system, we hope, in the future. FRBR was also used as the foundation for the Dublin Core abstract model, and we can expect a lot more experimentation and hopefully new systems that are designed on this model for the future. We can diagram the model of FRBR using boxes for entities, the things, connected by arrows to show the relationships that are connected then to other entities. This model is also one now being used in the semantic web for connecting things through a relationship to other things. This is also the fundamental ideas behind the linked data that's now happening in the semantic web in a cloud computing environment that I talked about a little this morning, if you remember. The example here, though, for this picture is to say that one entity, say a person, let's say it's Shakespeare, is the creator, which is the relationship, of the play Hamlet, which is the work. And we can say the relationships can go both directions, so you could also say that work Hamlet was created by Shakespeare, so it can go both directions. In our abstract model in FRBR, we moved it to a higher level to say person created a work. Work was created by a person. And if you then you can insert the appropriate values for whatever you're trying to describe, whatever resource that you want to describe. The FRBR entities are sorted into 3 groups for the convenience of talking about them. And, for example, the Group 1 entities, which are the product of artistic and intellectual endeavor, are the content, and also there are the packages that contain the data. So we have things called work, expression, manifestation, and item. So how many of you already know about FRBR? 1, 2. Okay, good. Good, good. So this will be familiar to you now. There are this relationship going on that a work is realized through an expression, expression is embodied in a manifestation, manifestation is exemplified by an item, and you'll notice it's not really strictly just a hierarchy. There are many connections. Those double arrow lines means it can be a whole network of things interconnected. Not just a one-to-one down a hierarchy, but many things that can be interconnected. So this is a really interesting model to describe this kind of thing. The vocabulary is really very important. So Patrick Leboeuf, who used to chair the FRBR review group, came up with this example to try and explain it. Typically in our language, we use words very freely, and it can be kind of a fuzzy distinction as to what we really mean. With FRBR, we're trying to be very exact as to what we mean. So, for example, in English, book, we can mean many things by that. We can mean something that we can hold in our hand that consists of paper, a binding. Sometimes you can use it to open up a door, put it in the door, or whatever. And you then call that physical thing, in FRBR, you call that an item. We can also say book when we mean something when we go to a bookstore. And we want, any copy will do. We just want one of them. But we can see on the shelves there are many copies of it. We may ask for it by an ISBN, International Standard Bibliographic Number. And FRBR calls this a manifestation. We can also say book, but we mean, like, who translated that book? And that may be a specific text that we have in mind, but we also want it in a particular language or translation. And FRBR calls that an expression. When we say book as in who wrote that book, we could also mean a higher level of abstraction, the intellectual or artistic ideas, the content that underlies all of the linguistic versions, the basic story that's being told, or the ideas in a person's head for the book. And FRBR calls that a work. We really want our language to be more precise to help future catalogers and future systems designers speak the same language so that we can work together to design future systems at this time of change. There's some essential characteristics or elements that we associate with each FRBR entity, and FRBR calls these attributes. In RDA, they're called elements. It's the same thing. For a work, the main attributes or elements are the title, perhaps when those ideas were thought of, if we know it, possibly some sort of identifier like is used for rights management, and other things there. What seems to be missing? When you're trying to identify a work, what's something important? Elena's saying author. Okay, the author is missing. Well, in fact, in FRBR, we decided to make the names of persons as a separate entity so that we could make a relationship to work to actually use the name of that person in many different roles. That person may be, in one situation, the author of a book. In another situation, they may be a publisher of a video recording. They could have different roles, so we wanted to set them up as a separate entity. We also have other characteristics at each of the FRBR levels for the Group 1 entities, as you see here. There are also relationships, and this picture is showing a continuum. Starting on the left-hand side, you'll notice that we have a lot of different things that are resources that are related to each other. At the far left-hand side, we have things that are actually equivalent. In other words, if you have a microform reproduction, or a copy, or a facsimile, or a reprint, often the content is the same. If we make some change to that content in a very slight way, we move to a new expression for a derivative work. And that could be things like translations or variations or versions or new editions. It's still the same work, but it has some slight changes to it. So we're continuing to move from the exact same text to something a little bit different, but basically it's the same work. Now in our cataloging rules, we reach a special magic line that says it's not the same work anymore. We've made enough changes to it that finally we have something different, like it's a parody or it's an adaptation based on the original ideas, but now it's new ideas by a new author, a new creator. And at the very far side, we have things that are actually describing that original work, things like criticisms or reviews or commentaries of that original work. And in fact, these things on this far right side are actually in FRBR terms in a subject relationship, because the subject of these is the original work. So relationships can be those inherent relationships between work, expression, manifestation, and items. They can be these kinds of derivative content relationships over time. But we can also have other kinds of relationships, like a whole-part relationship of the physical things that make up a collection, for example. We can also have sequential relationships, like the different issues of a monographic series, or the different issues of a serial, a serial publication. We also have accompanying relationships for things that are supplements or complementary indexes or text to pictures or all kinds of things that are accompanying each other. Now, that's the Group 1 entities in FRBR, and we go to Group 2 entities. They are the people, the corporate bodies, the families responsible for the intellectual artistic content, or responsible for the physical production or dissemination, or the custodianship of each of the products. Actually, the FRAD, F-R-A-D, added family to this list from FRBR, particularly to reach the needs of the archival community, where families are very important. So for the Group 2 relationships, you'll see how they're related now to the Group 1 entities, and they're the things I've just said, that an item can be owned by a person, a manifestation is produced by a person or corporate body, an expression is realized by a person, corporate body, or family, and a work can be created by a person, family, or corporate body. So back to the elements for work, for what we thought was missing. Remember the author being missing, the creator of the work? We can now see that it's treated as a separate Group 2 entity in FRBR. And the decision in conceptual modeling for this really depends on the future use. In this FRBR case, we saw major advantages in declaring persons and corporate bodies as separate entities related to each other. So that worked out really better for us. Now, the Group 3 entities, the final group, they're the things that serve as the subjects of intellectual artistic endeavor. It includes all of the Group 1 and the Group 2 entities, plus concept, object, event, and place. And so they are in a subject relationship with another work. In the functional requirements for bibliographic records, we also had the user tasks of find, identify, select, and obtain. And we find that this conceptual model helps us meet objectives of the catalog in really new ways. The FRBR really gives us a new view on what we've been doing all along. It gives us a new view on the bibliographic universe in a new way. So here we have an entry from the British Museum's printed book catalog from 1841. It did a beautiful job of co-locating all of the works of an author. So here we see the works of Cristóbal Acosta that were held in the British Museum at that time. FRBR gives us a new way of looking at this bibliographic universe, and as I said before, it's like putting on a new pair of glasses. So let's take a look at this with our FRBR glasses. See what we see. So, now we see with FRBR glasses that we have persons, Group 2 entities, we have works, we have expressions, we have manifestations, and we have items, not only listed as another copy, but also each of the other things are individually listed. So, this is just fun. But it's there already. FRBR just gives us a new way to see it. We can also do the same thing when we look at our online catalog. FRBR is already there. This is a listing in the Voyager catalog at the Library of Congress for the same Shakespeare Hamlet I mentioned before. And we see the work is already mentioned as part of the uniform title. The expression is already identified by saying it is in French. The manifestation is already there because we're describing the publication information. The item level information is already there too because we're describing the call number for that specific copy and we're saying where it is located. So FRBR is already there. All of this information in FRBR leads us to linked data that lets us co-locate all of the things and meeting again, back to Cutter again, remember the objectives of the catalog to find and co-locate, to bring together things. So with Cutter and with FRBR, we're able to bring together all of the works associated with a person, all of the expressions of the same work, all of the manifestations of the same expression, and all of the items or copies of the same manifestation. But in addition, since we're also including relationships, we can make connections now to the movies or the plays that are derivative works from this one showing for Don Quixote. And it can guide us and guide our users through our rich collections that we have and beyond, even beyond our libraries, to things like out to Wikipedia through the subject to see the Wikipedia article about Don Quixote. This was not possible at all when we had book or card catalogs. There's an amazing world of networked information, and in the past we've only been able to offer our users a small view of it. But now, once we begin to share all of this linked data on the internet, we can offer the resource discovery systems that will show all kinds of pathways to related resources that may be of interest to our users. The past year, we worked on the FRBR model for FRAD, and it added a few more things that are still also as fundamental things within RDA. And so it has bibliographic entities, names and identifiers, controlled access points, and remember a moment ago I mentioned that it also added the names of families. So we have the two models from IFLA, FRBR and FRAD, FRAD. that give us a picture of how we might design systems in the future in a different way. We're now using them as the concepts behind RDA, which is the new cataloging code. And we'll now see how that rich history and everything is being developed in RDA. But first, I want to mention that the evolution of technology really made a major turn when we created the Internet. Catalogs are no longer just standalone points in isolation. The book catalogs and the card catalogs and even the OPACs of the past, the online public access catalogs of the past, really were just for an individual library, individual collection. The catalogs, and especially the bibliographic data, can now be integrated into the wider Internet environment, and new kinds of links can be made and new displays can be generated for users from the data packaged in new ways. All of it now on a global scale, all over the world. We now have the technology to provide the global connection anywhere that computers can operate, and that includes the digital connections with cell phones or smartphones or iPads with Internet connections. RDA, the new code, is being designed to prepare us for the technological capabilities of the Internet for today and into the future. This looks familiar, I hope. We'll go back. Siguiente, anterior. Good. And hopefully we'll be able to freely access all of this information and get the data coming from publishers, coming from creators of resources as they actually create the resource, and from other libraries, from institutions anywhere. We'll be able to share all of that data about the resource. And we could do it anywhere, at any time, because it's global and it's on the Internet. Bibliographic data and digital resources are on the web now, and we've started adding our controlled vocabularies, like I mentioned this morning. And FRBR is preparing us, along with RDA, a new cataloging code, so that we can identify all of the elements, all of the identifying characteristics for these resources that we have in our collections, and do it in a new way so that machines can talk to each other about this and manipulate the displays that will be more useful to users. Our current cataloging environment continues to evolve to be more and more web-based. We need to catalog a much wider range of information carriers than we had to in the past. Not just books. We're doing all kinds of multimedia, web content, digital content, sound, images, everything. And metadata itself is being created by a wider range of personnel, not just by skilled professional catalogers, but also support staff from publishers with a wide variety of skill levels. Some of us are using structures other than marked formats for the records, like using Dublin Core for some digital resources. And we now have access to descriptive data for resources from in a digital form. Even when the resources is in a standard book format, the descriptive data may be coming in an electronic form from the publisher, like Onyx data, which is information we can then capture for our bibliographic records. So a key aspect of this new environment is built on an element-based metadata scheme, which we are using more and more now for RDA, and I'll come back to this in a moment as well. In the late 1990s, the Joint Steering Committee for Revision of the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules decided to actively make a change for the future of the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules. We realized that all of these changes in our environment and the development of all these conceptual models from IFLA and the new principles from IFLA gave us new opportunity to improve how we were cataloging and how we deliver bibliographic information to our users. So in 1997, we held the International Conference on the Principles and Future Development of AACR in Toronto. We invited experts from around the world to share in developing an action plan for the future of AACR. And some of the recommendations from that meeting have guided our thinking about new directions, such as the desire to document the principles, to be able to make a distinction between content and carrier, to analyze the logical structure of AACR and see if we could make it better, and to explore seriality. So after this meeting, we had the meetings with the ISBD review group and with the ISSN community community to harmonize our practices for seriality. And we developed continuing resources and integrating resources, so that followed from this meeting. We also, very importantly, wanted to take a more international view. So in 2002, with the addition of Anglo-American Cataloging rules that year, the Joint Steering Committee developed a strategic plan for how we would move into the future. And that RDA would be based on principles, it would be a new code that would be more consistent across all types of resources and media and content, and that it would demonstrate the commonalities of different types of resources, which hopefully would make it easier to apply. We also then stated our goals as having RDA as a standard for resource description and access designed for the digital world. It would be a web-based tool that was optimized for use as an online product, and a tool that addressed cataloging all types of content and media, and a tool that resulted in records intended for use in the digital environment through the internet, through web-based OPACs and linked data. The records created using RDA certainly can also be used to create card catalogs and book catalogs if you wish, but the structure of it and the idea of it as being an element-based structure is meant to be much more flexible for reuse of the data in an extensible framework. We wanted to also have this code not only used in libraries, but also adaptable to many, many information communities throughout the world. And we collaborated with many metadata communities to develop RDA. The structure of RDA is shown here. There's a general introduction to provide background, and the instructions are arranged to begin with describing a manifestation. It identifies all of the elements, all of the identifying characteristics for describing each kind of entity. At the end of the elements, there are instructions for constructing access points for each of the entities. And then we have chapters on guidelines for making relationships among the entities. At the very end, as you see here, are some appendices for things like capitalization, for abbreviations, for initial articles, and how to present descriptive data in the ISBD display format, in a Mark 21 display format, and so on. And also how to present authority data. AACR2 never dealt with authority control, but RDA now does. Remember, I also mentioned IFLA's international cataloging principles, and so this is the basic set of principles. And you'll notice that the very first one is saying that the convenience of the user is of utmost importance. And we should keep the user always in mind when we're providing bibliographic descriptions and access points. RDA is based on these new principles. To give you an idea of how following these principles means a change from AACR2, let's look at the principle of representation that I showed you on that previous slide. It comes into play for transcribed information. RDA simplifies the process of transcription, usually by taking what you see on the resource. This eliminates many of the rules that we had in AACR2 instructing a cataloger to alter the data, change the capitalization, change the punctuation, remove beginning information, lots and lots of rules. RDA, take what you see. This is also meant to be able to capture the data coming electronically with the thing that you're cataloging and reuse that metadata from many other sources so that you can just grab that by machine, and it saves the cataloger's time and effort. The differences between RDA and AACR2 are not so very many, but they are explained very well during the training that we will be giving for RDA's test, which I'll mention in a moment. The Joint Steering Committee has already started preparing these training materials, and we also have at the Library of Congress, and all of them are freely available to everyone. We are having some of them also. Some people are helping us translate them into Spanish, so hopefully you'll be able to take advantage of them even more. The RDA elements are identified element by element. This is meant to be a help, again, in the computer environment. It's an element-based approach that produces what we call well-structured metadata, and it makes the data in our descriptions much much more usable on the internet because it's similar to structures that are being used by other metadata communities, and particularly in the RDF environment, the rich data format environment for the semantic web. RDA will have a core set of elements recommended for identifying each entity. There are new elements that have been added to RDA, some to solve some problems that we had in AACR2, and some to add elements that are just completely missing from AACR2. The data elements for media type, carrier type, and content type will be used instead of the GMDs, the General Material Designators that are currently in AACR2 and in ISBD. One of the complaints about the GMDs was that they're not consistent. They're a mixture of content and carrier types, and the list is not complete. There are many more examples. At the end of this presentation, you'll see some when I will leave it for you to have access to the citations. But we'll have lots of different types of content, types of media, types of carrier that we can use, and we'll continue further harmonization discussions with the ISBD group so that we can agree on a structure for this in the future. We will also be helped by this through the test that we're doing of RDA in the United States. With RDA, we're making an attempt to update the card catalog-based terminology that remains in AACR2. So the term heading, of course, comes from the text that was printed at the heading or the top of a catalog card. We're replacing that term now with access point. So main entry and added entry headings become authorized access point, and variant forms become, that we used to do as C references, become variant access points. We also had problematic terms with uniform title, which is now going to be called a preferred title, or the name of a work. We have different scenarios that we were keeping in mind when looking at RDA, and for now most of us are living in an environment like this scenario 2, which uses MARC format records in an integrated library system of self-contained records. These records may or may not have any connection to each other, may or may not have a connection to an authority record, but it exists in a system and is being used this way. We're really now at a very exciting time for developing new information systems that are much more global in nature, that can make cataloging easier and make the results of cataloging much more flexible and useful to our users. So there's a scenario 3, which is used for book catalogs and card catalogs, and that also can be used for RDA if you wish. But the scenario 1, which is what we're hoping the future will be, is linked data on the internet. This picture is showing clusters of data that are all interconnected through relationships and making those relationships explicit. All of this data can actually be mined from our existing records. We don't have to start all over again. We can use what we already have created, but just display it and present it and reuse it in new, interesting ways. So this scenario of linked data enables us to preserve the important collocation objectives, to again display all the works associated with the person, all the expressions of the same work, and so on. All of this data, when it's described and labeled clearly, can be reused and repackaged in really creative ways for the future. What I'd like to show you now is how we can look at these scenarios and look at RDA as it intends to use the FRBR terminology and concepts to improve how we can structure records for the future and package them in new ways for future systems. We started with a catalog card, complete with the hole to put it into the drawer. It gave information like an author, a title, the type of content, the subject, displayed in a very typical way. This is not showing you the original display because that would be too difficult, but the data is there. Then we went to describing things in a MARC record in systems that had maybe separate authority records and would make a pointer between the bibliographic data and the authority record. It would take the subject data and put that in a subject authority file and make a link or a connection between the bibliographic record and the authority records. Next, we moved into an FRBR record environment where we just described the individual information. We could think of it as a record or just a cluster of data, so we can move item-level information to be described specifically as item level. We can take manifestation-level information, like the title and the carrier type, and identify it that way. We can move the expression-level data, identify it as expression. And for an FRBR work record, we can take the author and the subject information and make links to the related records for those entities. In the future record, in the linked data record of the future, we will actually make links out to the controlled vocabularies that are registered on the web. For example, taking the content type and linking it to the registry that actually is there now for RDA data for the types of content. We also have types of carrier registered on the web now. We will have the ability to link things in a note to the actual authority record. For example, this says the author, but we'll know it's actually meaning that particular person. We'll take the terminology for the labels from the registries on the web, and we will include registries coming from publishers, like for the Onyx data, and from IFLA for the FRBR displays of information. All of this then can be packaged in new and creative ways. The Joint Steering Committee for Development of RDA has an official JSC website that includes presentations and background documents that you hopefully will find helpful. We also have a series of webcasts, including one in Spanish that I did for Chile, so hopefully you'll be able to follow that and see it. I actually spoke in Spanish, amazing. But I'm very afraid to do it. This is the timeline for the test in the United States of RDA. The Library of Congress, the National Library of Medicine, and the National Agriculture Library are leading a test with 26 other partners this year, with a decision, we hope, in early 2011. So you'll see here that we expect to get the RDA toolkit in June. From June through the end of August, there will be free access to everyone in the world to RDA. You just have to go register, and you can have access to RDA Toolkit. After that, you have to pay for it. From June through September, we will have the U.S. testers have time to be trained and practice and get used to using this new tool. And then October 1 through December 31, we'll actually do the test. We'll have a set of common records that we all catalog. We'll put the information of our results of cataloging into a survey that will then compile the data for us. And then between January and March of 2011, we'll analyze those results and hopefully by then make a decision. I hope to implement. We'll see. So, in summary, RDA is a content standard intended for the digital environment. It can still be used for card catalogs and OPACs and so forth, but it's really looking to the future and preparing us for that future. But it contains some traditions from the Anglo-American roots and from IFLA's descriptive standards, but focuses on the user models coming from FRBR and FRAD and the International Cataloging Principles, and their user tasks, the elements, the relationships, and the attributes, and the vocabulary from those new tools and models. Throughout all of this is increased awareness of how small the world has become with all this internet capability, and how important it is to share bibliographic information globally and help reduce global costs. Our bibliographic and our authority information is being used worldwide now across different information communities. IFLA has updated all the underlying principles that support the organization of information in a new way to help build catalogers' judgment. And our new standard for resource description and access will enable us to more easily harvest the descriptive metadata in many sources in a much more flexible way now than we do now with the AACR2 and certainly with our Library of Congress rule interpretations that makes everything very rigid. So unlike AACR2, RDA will be based on the elements that are needed to describe those things in our bibliographic universe and to provide access to information about those things. It will have more controlled vocabularies that we will register on the internet for everyone to share, and it will increase the opportunities for more consistent data on the web and increase the precision of future searches. All of these things are interconnecting and leading us into the future of bibliographic control. They're providing us with updated standards for today's web environment while still supporting the traditional collections of our libraries and our archives and our museums, but RDA will be a tool to help us move into the future. So, gracias por su atención. Gracias.